Thank you to everyone for the support after my recent Truth Out article with Gerald Horn. Thank you as always to Awareness for the music. I'm speaking to you all from so-called Colorado, occupied Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute land. Today I spoke to a historian at Emory University, Dr. Dawn Peterson, about her book Indians in the Family, Adoption and the Politics of Antebellum Expansion. This book ranges from 1790 to Andrew Jackson's Genocidal Indian Removal Act in 1830. Some main characters Peterson follows through history are Choctaw woman Molly McDonald, her son James McDonald, Silas Dinsmore, who was an unpopular U.S. government official who adopted her son, the adopted child of Andrew Jackson named Lincoya, who was Creek and had much of his tribe murdered by Andrew Jackson, Thomas McKinney, who was an enslaver that took in Native American kids for adoption, saying re-education would keep Indians, quote, quiet at all times. Peterson does a great job of tying these narratives together while examining the structures of domination ranging from patriarchy, male-dominated households, white supremacy, and slavery. She also writes about the small minority of indigenous enslavers and also indigenous who were enslaved. She also examines colonialism and how this process of land dispossession by colonizers took place through debt, broken treaties, violence, and outright genocide. We talk about how as a non-native woman she began exploring U.S. imperialism, the context of adoption, the ramping up of capitalism in the colonial era, indigenous resistance, the ongoing threat of humanitarian intervention being used for imperialism, children being separated at the border, and the recently proposed anti-Antifa mask bill.
Well, I kind of wanted to start off just by you kind of talking about when you lost someone really close in your life after 9/11, and this became you said a turning point in your life, and how it informed your outlook and perspective on history.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So this book came in the wake of the 2001 attacks on a number of airplanes, World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and I had led a very privileged life. I'm a white woman, come from an upper middle class family. It was my first really experience of U.S. imperialism and racial capitalism hitting home, and I can talk more about that in terms of how I see 9/11 if you're interested. But it really, for me, the responses to those attacks were also devastating to see the ways in which real trauma for people who, I lost my brother, so folks like me who lost people very dear to us, the way our trauma was being used to then propagate U.S. imperialism against people who had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, and the 9/11 attacks themselves being the result of, U.S. violence in North America and overseas, in this case particularly the Middle East. So for me to see the ways in which these attacks should be a form of knowledge of what violence means, right? This should be a form of knowledge of what pain and suffering is for those who've largely, there were a number of poor and working class people in the World Trade Center. There were also a number of elite people in the World Trade Center, and that should have been knowledge. Poor and working class people have been dealing with U.S. imperial violence for a long time. Elite people, in various ways, have been shored up and protected from it and benefit from it. And this should be knowledge of what that kind of violence and pain and suffering means, what warfare means. And so for me to see those attacks being used to propagate further violence, it created what was already a horrible and untenable situation. For me, it exacerbated the pain that I was feeling and the anger that I was feeling around losing my brother. So that drove me to graduate school. I wanted to trace the deep roots of U.S. imperialism. I thought I was going to be ultimately doing research on the ways in which families in the 20th and 21st century, their pain had been mobilized for various projects that either benefited the U.S. carceral system, the prison industrial complex, and the military industrial complex. But I ended up finding this project that took me back to what I saw as the very roots of U.S. imperialism. Of course, one could argue that the roots go farther and farther back than the U.S. Revolution in terms of British expansion, the opening of the transatlantic slave trade, settler colonialism on the part of European empires. But for me, I wanted to go back to the emergence of the United States and see the forms of inequality that generated the revolution, or the catalyst for the revolution, and the ways in which family played a huge role in how the U.S. nation was built, various ideas about family, and whether it was the propagation of in support of certain kinds of families, namely families that were deemed white, and the real violence against other families and other kin who did not fit the model or were deemed unworthy of the model of the U.S. nuclear family, which was always part and parcel considered white. So I don't know, that's a kind of long, very long-winded answer that gets to where my trajectory came from. So just really trying to figure out what was this national family that got heralded after 9/11, what were its deep roots, and how did race and empire and gender really shape it.
Cool, and I'm sorry for your loss, and thanks for opening that up, because I did want to dig deeper into these constructions that you're talking about. And your book, Indians in the Family, goes from 1790 to around 1830s. And I kind of wanted to start out with adoption, which hadn't been formally codified until, as you write in your book, it went on record in Massachusetts in 1851. I was wondering if you can frame what you mean by adoption in the book, and you also point out there's a settler colonial definition, and then there's an indigenous definition as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So adoption is a very complicated term to use for this moment, and one that I argue I have to use kind of flexibly. But I think about it in terms of the settler colonial model, first and foremost, as a way of we'll take a little step back. As you mentioned, adoption wasn't codified until the 1850s in Massachusetts, and so the ways in which white settlers saw adoption was as if we think about kind of the formal adoption that we associate with a contemporary definition of the term. It's a term that means, obviously, that a child is incorporated into largely a nuclear family model, and there have been all kinds of politics around that, as we know, in terms of whether it's a same-sex couple or a hetero couple. And then Martha Feynman has written brilliantly about the ways in which the sexualized couple, so the married couple has become the definitional concept for incorporating children into families and definitions of parenthood. So that's very much the kind of liberal model, contemporary model that folks largely associate who are coming from liberal societies with adoption. Anglo-Americans in the early U.S. Republic similarly saw adoption as a way to incorporate children into families, as making them formal kin, formal descendants within nuclear families, but largely they eschewed those forms of adoption. Brian Connolly has written about this, really thinking of it as, because they don't see it as these children as directly blood, it becomes problematic in terms of their ideas of descent. But adoption certainly was utilized. Andrew Jackson adopted Andrew Jackson Jr. from his sister-in-law and her husband, because he and Rachel were not able to have their own children. So the Jackson descendants argue that he formalized this adoption through an act of legislature. That act has never been found, so it's questionable whether that happened or not. So it was certainly engaged, but largely other forms of incorporation were utilized to bring family into one's household when they were not considered direct descendants from, a nuclear couple. So there was wardships. Andrew Jackson, for example, had a number of wards in his household, and he was not alone. I found Silas Dinsmore, who I wrote about. I didn't write much about the ward that he had, and I don't know much about her, but he had a young ward in his home, someone he did not refer to as direct kin, but as someone he was responsible for taking care of. And then, of course, there is indenture and slavery as other ways to acquire children strictly for labor purposes, and, labor broadly defined. So there's, these were people who were incorporated into these homes directly, not as kin, right, but as people who could benefit the owners of the household in multiple and myriad ways. So that's where, for the way I see adoption in this book, is thinking about the ways in which Native people were considered adoptable into the early U.S. Republic, into a U.S. national family. So if we look back in the early Republic and the ways in which U.S. settler colonialism and settler expansion is operating, Native people are formidable. They're formidable opponents for the United States. They're trying to negotiate with the United States in myriad ways, trying to secure land and sovereignty as U.S. settlers and the U.S. federal government. State governments are increasingly encroaching into new indigenous territories west of the settlements along the continent, the Atlantic littoral. They're encroaching into the continental interior. Native people have access to arms and international alliances with European empires, and that makes them really impossible to defeat militarily for the United States government and for individual settlers themselves. And so for federal elites, folks like Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, imagining Native people as adoptable into the early U.S. Republic, as they envision the early U.S. Republic as a kind of national family, and they imagine Native children, in my case, looking at the adoption of Native children, but they think of Native people writ large as adoptable into this national family, into the early U.S. Republic. And Jefferson, I spent a lot of time on Notes of the State of Virginia to really talk about the ways in which the racial formulations of indigenous people are operating in the U.S. settler society at this time as almost but not quite white, borrowing from Homi Bhabha there, but really thinking about the ways in which they're considered through various changes in cultural practices. They're considered to be people who could be free white citizens in the early Republic. And of course, there's all kinds of caveats to that, and I really spent some time talking about the ways in which Jefferson says this is probably white. There's no guarantee, right? But this is a way in which the United States is able to justify various other kinds of avenues through which federal elites are aiming to incorporate Native people through non-military means, so using civilization policies and other kinds of economic policies to make Native people, or to really intervene in Native economies to make Native people more vulnerable to U.S. land cessions and expropriation. So those are kind of, again, my answers to all these questions are pretty long, but that's a roundabout way of how I see adoption. They're deemed adoptable, so it may not, whether it's through literal adoptions of children that I write about, or whether it's through this kind of larger lens of Native people as adoptable into a national citizenry.
Mm-hmm. And you changed the kind of the title of Jefferson's book. You flipped it into a subtitle of Notes on the State of Reproduction.
Yeah.
In your book, and you also speak about these other ways of how the U.S. was seeking to acquire land. It kind of seemed to how Thomas Jefferson had used this IMF type model of debt to get resources or land. Can you elaborate on this? This was another way that getting land into the Ohio country and other areas.
Yeah, no, that you hit the nail right on the head. That kind of blew my mind when I was reading Jefferson and Knox and these other they're technocrats, right? Seeing the ways in which they're envisioning a debt economy as a way to manipulate the populations that they hope to have. They hope to be subservient within a U.S. empire, and of course, and also to extract resources from them, and in this case, the resources, namely land. But that was, to me, when I came across it, I was like, whoa, this is the deep roots of the kinds of economic imperialism we've been seeing for decades, right? I mean, and especially we can go back to U.S. interventions in the Mexican Revolution, but certainly in terms of the neoliberal turn as well, right? That this is a way to use economic violence as opposed to direct military occupation. Now, of course, there are military occupations to back these up, and we see this in the early Republic as well. Where you have folks like Jefferson and Knox, to get back to actually answering your question, who really see, okay, so if initially Native, it's first, it really kind of in the 1780s and 90s, it's particularly before 1794, the United States doesn't have the military power nor the finances to back major military interventions with the Indian country, and are really worried about the transatlantic implications, the transatlantic warfare that such occupations could generate, not only against really powerful Indian nations, but their allies, namely Britain, Spain, and France. And France is really withdrawing largely by the 1790s, but certainly Britain and Spain are not. And so this is where you see, one, the kind of real strategic calculations in terms of military resources elites are making, but also the kinds of moral calculations they're making. So they're well aware that they are espousing, they are taking the position that the United States is a nation of liberty, but they're trying to have to somehow reconcile this, that this is a nation of racial slavery and a nation of settler colonialism and national expansion, so that has to deal with directly indigenous dispossession. And so they, some folks like Jefferson are looking for ways to reconcile both the strategic, economic, and the moral implications of occupation and dispossession vis-a-vis indigenous people. And we can go into the ways in which they obviously have explanations around racial slavery as well. But in terms of this debt economy, they really see, okay, well, if we can slowly bring Native people into U.S. trade orbits, Native people have been part of transatlantic trade networks at this point for hundreds of years, that if we can bring Native people into U.S. trade orbits and slowly sever European empires from much of the North American continental interior that the United States is hoping to claim, and as you mentioned, the Ohio River Valley as well as the native Southeast, that this is a way in which we can pull, the United States can, and these are, I'm speaking we here, federal elites, they're saying, well, if we can pull Native people into U.S. commercial orbits and remove their European trade partners, over time we can inflate our prices and bring them into debt into the U.S. Trade economy. And through that debt we can say, okay, well, if you want more trade goods, if you want access to any more manufactured supplies that the United States can offer, well, then you're going to have to give up land. And so Jefferson is quite explicit about this in a letter to William Henry Harrison in the very early 19th century, right around the time of the Louisiana Purchase, that if the United States can, in fact, use this method, that the United States will acquire huge amounts of native land without military occupation. But there's always a caveat, and Jefferson and Henry Knox in earlier decades, Henry Knox is the first Secretary of War, that if Native people don't comply with this, that the United States can also use military means to acquire native land in various just wars. And they go into, and if you're interested, I can talk more about this, into various definitions of what just war would be.
Mm-hmm. And, well, I guess that leads me to another question I had when you're really talking about this ramping up of capitalism, and the policy was to dispossess the indigenous population. It was really extraordinary. You found these writings by Henry Knox talking about introducing these capitalist themes such as private property and individual gain. You say he was focused on race, reproduction, property, and progress. And one of his quotes is, "Were it all possible to introduce among the Indian tribes a love for exclusive property, it would be a happy commencement of the business." Can you elaborate on some of these findings that you found on this? I think we're already digging into this.
Yeah. So, of course, and I touched on this already, Native people have been part of a transatlantic trade network for a long time before Henry Knox made these kinds of arrogant statements. And Claudio Sant, Taya Miles, Barbara Krauthammer, and others have written about the ways in which ideas about private property were, existent in Indian country. Really, there are debates in terms of how long, but we're seeing this by the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. Some Native people are already engaging in certain kinds of private property practices. Namely, in the Southeast, you have some Southeast Indian elites, largely those who are they're coming out of families where you have white traders intermarried with Native women. There are all kinds of debates about this, but you largely see the vast majority in these early years are holding people of African descent as slaves, as private property to be bought and sold. And so that is a form of capitalism that is already in Indian country at this point. There are various debates about whether or not one can see trade, the kinds of trade Native people are engaging with. Richard White has written about this in Roots of Dependency, and there are, again, critiques of some of these arguments, but that through the fur trade, right, Native people are buying and trading, or they're selling furs, right, for manufactured goods, but there's also notions of individual and private property. Now, Native people have long had sense of property, so this way that early federal elites like to describe Native people as kind of devoid of a sense of property. That's completely hogwash. That Native people had long had a sense of property. In the Southeast, I write a lot about Southeast Indian nations, and particularly the Choctaw Nation. Women were considered the holders of landed property. So women and matrilineal descendants were considered the ones who had the rightful ownership of the land because they worked it. They were the ones who grew agriculture, and they were the ones who produced goods out of the land. And so because it was their labor, and there's also the relationship between women and corn, a deep spiritual relationship, that was considered the land they worked it, they labored, it was their labor, so they deserved the fruits of their labor, right? They own the fruits of their labor. So there's a long-standing notion of property. So for Knox, he has this sense that, okay, well, ignoring the long history of Native people in transatlantic trade, but also simultaneously aware of it because, you know, folks like Knox and in the early Trade and Intercourse Acts, which I talk about in my book, there's other congressional elites who are talking about, okay, well, Native people need to be severed from their transatlantic ties, namely with Britain and France to some degree and Spain, right? They need to be severed from these transatlantic ties, but they simultaneously need to be introduced to trade and capitalism. So it's this kind of strange, delusional narrative that they have. And so they're essentially saying, okay, they need to be severed from these ties and then introduced to, you know, this form of capitalism. We're going to impose what they call the civilization system on them, which is basically an economic policy. Native nations are civilizations already, obviously. So we're going to impose these particular kinds of economic policies, they argue. And that's going to introduce a certain model of governance and economy on them, namely the settler capitalism, racial capitalism, and that within this model, Native people are going to reorganize themselves out of matrilineages in the Southeast, which is Southeast Indian nations are all engaged in matrilineal descent systems, and we're going to impose patriarchal systems under which capitalism most effectively operates, they argue, and namely nuclear patriarchal households. And within these households, Native people are going to farm the land, they argue, even though Native women had long been farming the land, and actually Native people taught Anglo settlers how to farm the land, but they argue that Native people are going to farm the land. Namely, they're arguing that Native men are going to farm the land. So they ignore Native women's long history with farming and agriculturalism. They say Native men are going to farm the land. Native women are going to go into the house. They're going to be protected within the household by their men. So they make this argument that Native matrilineage, rather than empowering women, makes them vulnerable through excessive labor systems. So this is a way in which to eradicate the power that Native women had from land ownership and make them subservient within a patriarchal household. And so they essentially argue through this, Native people would actually be able to survive settler colonialism. They would live on smaller swaths of land that were farmed by men who were strong enough to effectively reap the fruits out of agriculture out of the land, and that Native women would be protected within these domestic spaces, and then through that they would have lots of babies. So Knox and Jefferson made these reproductive arguments that within patriarchal households, women had more children. They said women enslaved by patriarchs and Native women who'd been married to white men within patriarchal households had more babies, and used this as a model through which to assert that male-headed capitalist households produced more populations than any other household configuration in the world. So this becomes a self-serving narrative that allows for them to morally justify the imposition of these economic systems on Indian country.
Well, you already dug right into my next question, which was how does patriarchy play into this along with white supremacy by seeing Native Americans as non-male dominated societies?
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was going to be my next question, which you already dug into quite well on. A lot of the writings, as you say, were obsessed with changing the indigenous family models to a Eurocentric and white family model.
Yeah, Yeah, it's really powerful, right, to see the ways in which family is sitting up, but narratives around family and kinship are sitting at the heart of settler colonial justifications for settler occupation, and also for the very technologies that are being implemented for dispossession. And that's what I found really, like, family itself becomes an economic model / technology for really extractive and exploitative policies and practices.
And I guess, so my next question was, can you speak about some stories on indigenous resistance to these practices? I know you say that some indigenous populations saw U.S. whites taking in children as less sinister because they were having them educated to negotiate treaties and not rely on interpreters.
Right. Yeah, so there's a whole web of resistance strategies, and this is where in the book I hope I effectively highlighted that resistance never took a single form, and that actually, in fact, how to deal with settler occupation is a contested and debated reality amongst indigenous people, that there's not a single strategy, right? And in some ways, there are a lot of folks who've written about this. I'm thinking about the work of Lisa Brooks or Gregory Evans Dowd, who talk about how Native people with different strategies and policies work together to resist U.S. settler expansion, and prior to that, Anglo-American settler expansion, if we're talking about the region that I'm writing about. But largely, so, for example, when Andrew Jackson adopts Lincoya around 1813 during the height of the Creek Civil War, which Andrew Jackson inserts himself into, we're really seeing, actually, in that Civil War, really different approaches to surviving Creek survivance with it, that's a term that Gerald Bisner writes about, what is survivance for indigenous people. So to really think about how to persist in the context of U.S. settler expansion. And so for some Creek people, and these are largely folks settled and living in Lower Creek country, and some are intermarried families. So you have some white traders who, again, we talked a little bit about, are really introducing and solidifying the practice of racial slavery amongst some families, really normalizing it. Ty Miles, in her work, both her first two books, talks about how some of these traders are really in the process of normalizing racial capitalism in terms of racial slavery within a particular subset of families, and she's writing of the Cherokee Nation. But again, so you see some folks who are using racial slavery largely in Lower Creek country, largely intermarried families, but not solely, who see really kind of accommodating, and I use that term advisedly, but adopting in their sense. And we can get back to, I realize now that we didn't talk earlier on about Native understandings of adoption, but in this case I'm dealing with an economic term, but adopting certain forms of racial capitalism in order to survive alongside and really maintain a certain kind of economic sovereignty against the United States. So for some folks, it was engaging in the plantation economy itself. Folks in the Upper Creek Nation, again, not exclusively, but this is really Red Stick country, which Andrew Jackson invades during the Creek Civil War, really believe that the trappings of, the racial slavery itself, private property ownership in the sense of alienable land and alienable goods, as opposed to forms of redistribution, which were more traditional Creek economies. So one didn't, and I was talking about this just the other day, the insanity of thinking, okay, in our society, U.S. society, contemporary moment, the society protects those who hoard. That behavior was considered antisocial and kind of pathological in long-standing Creek economies. You gain power by giving away your stuff as opposed to hoarding it. What good is anyone who hoards their stuff to anybody else? But if you can redistribute material goods, that actually makes you quite powerful. So Red Sticks in the Civil War really held to more long-standing Creek forms of governance and economy, and really opposed the kinds of economic systems that were emerging amongst Lower Creeks with these economic systems were desires to centralize political government and governance for all kinds of strategic reasons. One, to defend land against the United States, but two, to also protect private property. So there is essentially a civil war that erupts over precisely getting at what you were saying, the diverging strategies. And there are more strategies than these two. I'm kind of being reductive here for the purpose of explanation and introduction, but that these are two strategies, for example, that actually led to civil war, and this is but there's these ongoing contests of how and struggles over how to defend against U.S. settler society. So those are two forms of resistance, and of course Andrew Jackson sees this as a prime moment to intervene in when the Creek Nation is vulnerable as a result of civil war for self-defense, and essentially crush the Red Sticks and then demand one of the largest land cessions, if not the largest land cession that the United States had ever demanded of a tribal nation at that point. So I hope that answers your question in terms of thinking about some of the resistance strategies, and then we can talk about adoption too as one of them. As you've mentioned at the beginning of the question, it becomes one way in which Native families imagine they can empower their children in a rapidly changing world.
Yeah, and you mentioned that they had used their colonial educations to push back against U.S. expansion.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'd like to shift the topic for a second to this whole history of the, quote, founding fathers. There's a lot of hagiography, or the study of saints. Can you speak about your teaching philosophy and perspectives, such as Washington being known as town destroyer to the indigenous population, or Andrew Jackson having bridle reins made out of creek skin?
To think about the fact that these people are heralded, right, as national heroes in our particular moment. Andrew Jackson, for our current president, becomes a symbol. I just was seeing an image the other day where he was in front of the portrait of Andrew Jackson, and what that actually stands for so many people, which is for indigenous people, it stands in for, someone who was notorious for the brutality that he inflicted on Native people through warfare and through forced removal policies. And for someone, and then, Andrew Jackson doing so, right, for the expansion of slave country into the Southeast. So here's someone whose very image represents slavery and genocide, right? And then for George Washington, the founding father of all founding fathers, he, Erica Dunbar also wrote, a brilliant book about the ways in which slavery played a pivotal role in his understanding of himself. And then, as someone, Alyssa Mount Pleasant has written about him as amongst others, as the town destroyer for the slash and burn strategies he used, particularly in Haudenosaunee country during the 7 Years' War, and then again during the Revolution. That he is someone who also stands for what I see as the twin forms of dispossession that oriented the U.S. Revolution and the early U.S. Republic. So the way I teach them, some people argue that they're men of their times. Sure, in some ways we're all people of our times, but if we look at our current time, people make all kinds of choices about who they're going to be in that time. So these folks made choices, right? Yes, they were produced out of a certain economic system, but they certainly did their darnest to expand, entrench, and solidify it. So the way I teach them in the classroom is doing my best to undo the national mythology around these folks and really highlight the kinds of violence that enabled their power, and how that violence underpins the nation itself to this day. So I never really thought about it in terms of a teaching strategy before, but now you ask that question, I'm like, that's part of the work that I try to do in teaching these folks.
Yeah, and kind of undoing those nationalistic knots is a tough job and tough thing to do, but that's the power of history, and teaching that I think you do very well in. Well, I guess going back into my next question, in Noam Chomsky's book, Year 501, he explains that these violent aggressions of imperialism have always been done under the guise of humanitarian intervention. Mm-hmm. And you see these parallels in your book with Andrew Jackson, and then if you go back and look at Columbus, Christopher Columbus said that he was here to care for the Indians and let no harm or hurt be done to them. Mm-hmm. And then when Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, he said, having done my duty to my red children. And then, of course, there's the cartoon of the Great Father drawing of Andrew Jackson. Can you speak on these narratives that you found?
Yeah, no, it's really so true. The way in which U.S. imperial violence is wrought is always through this narrative of benevolence. So we touched a little bit on Knox, right? If we can circumscribe Indian people on their lands into small nuclear families, they're going to actually, in the end, have more babies, which is going to mean that they are going to survive alongside the settlers who encroach into their land. And he's leaning on an argument that Native people only rely on wild game for food, and as settlers encroach on Native hunting grounds, then Native people are going to run out of wild game and they're going to starve to death. And again, he ignores the long history of agriculturalism that has largely supported and sustained Native people in the Southeast and elsewhere. So this narrative of humanitarianism runs deep. And if we see Andrew Jackson, going back to your question with the Indian Removal Act, he argues, okay, well, Native people in the east of the Mississippi are never going to be able to, quote unquote, advance quickly enough, leaning on this Knox narrative and this Jeffersonian as well, this enduring narrative in the early republic, and one could argue to this day, this enduring narrative that Native people can't survive and subsist alongside white settlers. And so he argues that if he can forcibly remove them to the trans-Mississippi West, give them, quote unquote, more space, regardless of the fact that you already have settlers who are encroaching on lands that Native people are supposed to be relocated to, that they'll have the space to live in their supposedly, he uses judgment-laden and imperial language, calling Native societies ancient. Well, sure, there's long-standing forms of knowledge, but he's using ancient not in any kind of positive framing, but in a kind of pejorative way of that they're behind the times, regardless of the fact that Native people are actually some of the most, there's a number of really great books coming out now showing the ways in which in Southeast Indian history you have Native people being some of the most savvy actors in the plantation economy in the trans-Mississippi West. James McDonald, who I write about in in my book, his matrilineal cousin being one of them, he's become the largest slaveholder in the trans-Mississippi West. He's in the Choctaw Nation. So you see that Jackson is using imperial language to essentially marginalize and create a really distorted picture of how Native people live in order to assert that the United States is actually caring for people by removing them, which, when one looks at it, is patently absurd, but one that settlers, many, not all, but many, and there are debates about this I write about in my book, applaud because it allows them to take native land and feel good about it too. And this is where I have a great mentor in my life who talks about the human intellect can convince itself of anything if it really wants to. And this is where that humanitarian language, settlers twist reality into all kinds of knots to justify what is dispossession and recategorize it as benevolence.
And you had one quote from Andrew Jackson after the battle with Red Sticks at Tallapoosa River that I had never seen before, where he says these same type of things. The fiends of the Tallapoosa will no longer murder our women and children or disturb the quiet of our borders, and these types of this type of rhetoric. What I wanted to talk a little bit about Lincoln, the Creek-adopted son of Andrew Jackson. This also seemed to be hard to navigate as well. So he was seen as a tactic, and then sometimes Lincoln was treated as a sincere son, but then he was given to Andrew Jackson's white son in a way, and then he was also referred to as a pet by Jackson.
Yeah, so it's hard to know much about this young man's actual life and experience because we literally have nothing. He wrote with his own hand and then died really young. But Jackson, I argue, situates him in this kind of ambivalent space. And really, I see Jackson being someone who largely thinks about what the people in his life how they can empower him. And so Lincoya, this is Jackson being a slaveholder holding large number of people in bondage and very familiar and comfortable with using other people's labors and their lives to empower himself and enrich himself. And I argue that he sees Lincoya no differently, even as he he uses paternalistic language with those he enslaves and uses similarly paternalistic language with Lincoya, but Lincoya is formally free. It's actually illegal to enslave indigenous people at this point in North America, although there's a long history of native slavery in North America, and many are informally enslaving indigenous people still. It's just not technically legal for Jackson to do so. But Lincoya, he does educate Lincoya alongside his sons for quite some time, but at 16 makes the choice of indenturing him to a saddler. And I argue in my chapter that, as much as from the evidence, my kind of speculative conclusion is that for Jackson, Lincoya at a certain point doesn't serve a political purpose for him anymore. So early on, when he's known for his great violence against indigenous people and is critiqued for it by a certain subset of U.S. whites, that Lincoya for him is a way to say, look, I believe in Indian, quote-unquote civilization, so look at this young boy I have in my home. I'm not really this genocidal monster. I have compassion, too. I am a Christian man. I am a great shepherd. He uses this language of Christianity as he's referring to Lincoya as a kind of lost sheep that is in need of Jackson's paternalistic guidance. So that there is this language that he's using that is leaning on this kind of civilization paradigm, even as what he's engaging in, in the Creek War is, he proudly writes home to his wife Rachel about essentially massacring a village, which is to me nothing short of genocidal behavior. And so this is his way of positioning Lincoya within the so-called national family that we talked about earlier on today, that Lincoya is adoptable. Lincoya he believes in this assimilation paradigm that the United States has espoused, and this benevolent kind of Native people will be brought into the fold, supposedly introduced to capitalism and can live with and alongside whites as they relinquish territory and U.S. settler expansion unfolds as they believe it inevitably will. But Lincoya is then in an ambivalent space within Jackson's home. It's clear Jackson wants him to live as a formally free person, and in his writing is pretty clear that that's the position he wants Lincoya to have, and yet he makes a decision when Lincoya is a young boy to indenture Lincoya to a saddler, which is actually the very profession that Jackson himself eschewed when he fled his own family after he was orphaned during the Revolutionary War. Lincoya operates in this ambivalent space, but and is formally free. But I really see Jackson's view of Lincoya as one in which he can use this young boy to position himself politically, within the early republic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in your book, you write that adoption was used to mask the violence of expansion. Can you speak about the precedent that these adoptions set and the, quote, civilization program set with Native American boarding schools, these Catholic schools, and such as the Carlisle Institute that were later instituted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as I kind of touched briefly upon this in my book, but there's there's a long history of schooling that preceded these adoptions within the British Empire, and Jane O'Brien has written about this. Lisa Brooks has written about this. Margaret Connell-Sass, to mention just a few of the folks who've written about Alyssa Mount Pleasant as well. Colonial schooling that both preceded and operated contemporaneously with these adoptions, but that there's a long history of settler desires to try to incorporate or make subservient indigenous populations through schooling. But I argue that in my book, in the early U.S. Republic, we see some of the adoptions, and most specifically, there's the first head of he's the first head of the BIA, and before that, he's the superintendent of Indian Trade, Thomas McKenney. He incorporates a number of young boys into his household, and as he does so, he uses them to promote what he sees as a national schooling campaign on the part of the United States, boarding schools for indigenous people. And so there are mission schools that are operating, really kind of expanding after the War of 1812, and the War of 1812 is really the time when the United States is able to largely circumscribe British presence in the Ohio River Valley and the Southeast. And largely it's considered the turning point in which the United States is the sole imperial power in much of the region that I'm writing about, east of the Mississippi River, which is a huge, huge loss for Native people in the sense that they no longer have international allies to help support them in their fight against U.S. settler expansion. And so we know from contemporary wars, right, that having international allies is part and parcel of whether it's self-defense or imperial aggression. Whether the United States engaged in some ways unilaterally post 9/11, but also had alliances, for example, with Great Britain. So we see how these are ongoing forms of strategy during warfare, and Native people really relied for arms as well as international support, other forms of international support. So the War of 1812 becomes this turning point. And so you see these rise of mission schools after the War of 1812 as Indian country becomes, quote unquote, safer for missionaries. Missionaries imagine themselves as being able to, live outside of indigenous warfare and self-defense against the United States and live safely, but they're actually part and parcel of an ongoing war against indigenous people. So you see this expansion, even as indigenous people, I want to say, also navigated missions in strategic ways and also relied on missionaries for certain kinds of tools and technologies, largely as they're engaging in treaty negotiations and other forms of economic negotiations with the United States. So, but Thomas McKenney, to get back to him, really sees that these mission schools operating in concert with the U.S. government in a kind of expanded civilization program that's tied to a trade program that would then be part and parcel of continuing to use debt to acquire indigenous territory and using debt to keep Native people subservient to the United States. He sees these as operating tangentially to really orchestrate U.S. expansion. And he sees again that this is he sees this as a kind of benevolent position on his part. And I argue that a lot of the template that he lays out gets picked up again in the 1890s after the end of the ongoing warfare against Indian people west of the Mississippi that happens in the wake of the Civil War, and as part and parcel of Reconstruction. There's a whole new body of scholarship coming out now that looks at the ways in which Reconstruction unfolded in Indian country as well as in the South. So that's really, I argue that we can see this kind of template for boarding schools in the visions that someone like Thomas McKenney is articulating really in the 1820s and early 1830s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really found that part of the research really interesting. I wanted to ask you about what's going on currently in the U.S. What parallels do you see with families being separated at the border currently? This has been described by Ojibwe Jesse Wente as a colonial problem, not a partisan issue. And as you point out in your book, in immigration, a topic of immigration.
Yeah. I mean, and going back to, the colonial problem, right? This is, the current administration has amplified these separations. These were not unique to the current administration. They go back, they go back to the previous administration, if not before, right? So that this is, I think, we're still I always feel like when being in the midst of a current moment, it's hard to, even with the longevity of the practice, trying to figure out exactly what it means in the moment. But the core truth of it to me is that some families are deemed to matter and some are not. And I use family advisedly here in the sense of, there are all kinds of separations of children from guardians that may or may not be kin in the way that family means for in terms of liberal society of the United States. So, but that some human connections are deemed and emotions and affiliations are deemed to matter, and part and parcel of the racialization of populations is saying that their human connections don't. We can see this with the history of racial slavery, the separation of families through all kinds of practices, but sale being one of them, and then murder and violence being another. That this is when human connections are for certain populations, our human connections are deemed unworthy of protection or of even existence. So I see this as part of our current moment. We see that these ongoing detentions from the administration that supports folks who say that all lives matter. Well, some lives clearly are deemed to matter more than others, and if these were, I think we're in a moment of climate change, right? And who's to say that the kinds of stabilities certain folks in the United States enjoy and the kinds of privileges they have are inherent and permanent. What happens if I'm a big fan of Octavia Butler and her Parable of the Sower series, and thinking about the ways in which she imagines different kinds of human migrations in the not so distant future. And so, I don't know where I'm kind of going with this, but some of these same populations who are supporting these horrific detentions and separations and the brutalities that are unfolding within these detention centers, human migration may not be so far distant for populations that are currently privileged here, and how would they feel at the borders facing similar practices? I don't know. Octavia Butler's been going through my head a lot recently as we've been witnessing this unfold.
Yeah, and that ties into my last question, which is how do you see the connection from your book to present situations of ongoing indigenous struggles to protect their land or the resources, such as the Standing Rock, No Dapple protests, Trump's tax bill that included indigenous lands on Bears Ears? Yeah. And these all still tie into climate change as well.
Oh, of course, yeah. Of course, Dapple and going right under drinking water supplies, and what these pipelines mean in terms of doubling down on fossil fuel production and consumption as we're facing pretty dramatic weather changes, what just unfolded in the Carolinas and Virginia, and then what we've been seeing the last several years elsewhere, and of course those who are currently the most vulnerable economically are hit hardest. But in terms of the current administration, it's an ongoing assault on indigenous sovereignty. And again, going back to the current president standing in front of the Andrew Jackson portrait, he makes pretty clear what his position is, and it is pretty explicitly white supremacist. And I've been kind of thinking a lot about Kavanaugh's, the Ford's accusations of sexual assault, which are very backed up by a pretty large community that knew him and knew the context. But that prior to this coming out, Ford's assertions of what happened, prior to that, you have Kavanaugh's former legal assistant making a neo-Nazi sign behind him, and this to me it seems crazy that in and of itself didn't disqualify him from a Supreme Court seat. That in the Me Too movement, sexual assault becomes, and this is where folks are talking about how sexual assault is key, and in terms of thinking through ongoing forms of sexual violence against women, but not solely women. But that also is tied to racial violence, and that we have to think intersectionally around this. And so, why is not a white supremacist neo-Nazi sign by an assistant who's sitting right behind him not enough to disqualify him? And part of white supremacy is violence against people of color, including sexual violence against people of color. So, and if we go to Native history, ongoing, enduring, we see violence against Native women are experiencing the highest rates of violence, including especially sexual violence. The Violence Against Women Act that actually gives Native nations some ability to prosecute non-Native people is coming up again for renewal, and I don't know how that's going to pass in this current in the current Congress. But see it as, I guess, an ongoing assault on Indigenous sovereignty that is gendered and racialized and sexualized.
Yeah, and these white supremacist movements are highly misogynistic, as you say, and these man camps of fracking in North Dakota have seen huge amounts of violence against Indigenous women, especially.
And then, North Dakota also being notorious for its Native child removal policies that are also ongoing, and relocating Native children into non-Native families, largely white families. And then the financial benefits for foster families, non-Native foster families get for holding Native children, so fostering Native children. So we see the economic benefits for some through this form of kinship, nothing more than kinship extraction. So.
What are you working on now? What's your next project going to be focused on?
Yeah, it's currently very inchoate, but I am fascinated by the Muscle Shoals region, so largely now kind of bordering Alabama, Tennessee, currently known as. But in the 1780s, 1790s, it becomes an important place of resettlement for Cherokee people, Chickamauga Cherokees especially, Creek people, some Shawnee people who are resettling as a result of settler encroachment on many of their long-standing territories. And there's a family there, the Melton family. There's a woman intermarried to a white trader. So they are folks who are had largely integrated, and her descendants remarried into white settler communities, but are really distantly related to this woman. They refer to her as Akuma or Akuma Teftoya, and I have yet to find the records that they are leaning on for that name. But this Melton family, this woman, she's Cherokee, and she's married to this man Melton, and they set up on Melton's Bluff, where apparently he engages in piracy against U.S. settlers migrating to settle in Kentucky and Tennessee, and he steals large numbers of the people they enslave and essentially sets up a booming plantation business for himself and his wife. And she may have, from some of the sources I've been able to pull together, and I'm still just trying to, this is like needle in the haystack kind of stuff, but she seems to have ties to folks who are engaging in pan-Indian resistance movements against the United States, as well as people who are engaging in the plantation economy as a form of gaining individual wealth and territorial security that will allow them to hold on to some of their land as U.S. settlers increasingly swarm around them. So she seems to have these complicated, going back to resistance that we talked about earlier, complicated kinship ties to various forms of resistance strategies. But I'm really curious of how this mountain family is fitting into this larger picture of Pan-Indian resistance and resettlement along this Muscle Shoals area in the 1790s, and then in the wake of the War of 1812 and Andrew Jackson's invasion of the Creek Nation during the Creek Civil War, Andrew Jackson ends up buying this plantation from the mountains and tries to create this, he sees it as this booming future plantation town. It ends up becoming a ghost town, and the bluff gets reabsorbed into another elite man's plantation and is largely part of his plantation ground. So it's sort of also this story of Jackson and imagining a settler empire and a kind of elite settler city that ends up also completely failing in terms of his geographical and economic vision of this region. So it's kind of a mess still, but I'm fascinated by this place and all of the. There's also a significant narrative that was written by a women journalist who shows some of the relationships between enslaved people and this Cherokee woman on Mountains Bluff. This is what it becomes known as, and so we see the ways in which enslaved people are also at the center of this story of resettlement and economic change and racial capitalism for the mountains who are engaging in. I mean, they are engaging in a project that is accumulative. So that's where this kind of this region and this cluster of activity is really fascinating me.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a whole new research project, just like your last book that I have never dug into. That looks so interesting.
It's the thing about, I just feel like the more I dig into U.S. history and Native history, African American history at this time, the more I realize it kind of turns everything I think I know on its head. So this is kind of another one of those projects that's doing that for me. So.
Yeah, and with the past very nationalistic histories, a lot of those gaps were never filled.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't fit into these smooth narratives of teleological progress. That's another kind of major thing that actually Howard Zinn's first chapter of People's History, I always assign that as a way of kind of thinking through undoing this notion of teleology in history, that there's a progression towards greater consciousness. But in fact, there's, which is of course the U.S. national narrative, right? There was this blip called slavery, but now it's slavery to freedom and, marching forward in progress.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I have a new article coming out, I think next week, about the Antifa unmasking. Have you heard about the bill? The unmasking Antifa bill?
Yes, I know.
So I do an article.
Antifa right now are, not surprising.
Yeah, the bill's so ridiculously ideologically named. So I'm doing an article on that where I interview some authors and talk a little bit about the history. And I can send you that when that comes out.
Yeah, I would love to see that. And I know too that the liberal critique of Antifa drives me nuts for those who are even see themselves on the kind of progressive political somewhat left, and they're shredding of Antifa. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys! Think of how things would have gone down in Charlottesville, right, without Antifa there. I mean, nobody talks about the fact that Antifa was actually there protecting African American communities from white supremacist violence. They were there as an accountability, right? And that gets completely erased from the narrative. And I don't mean to say protecting in terms of a paternalistic way, but understand, trying to be bodies on the ground and bodies in the line in terms of racial solidarity, and the way that they get narrated even by the progressive left as a fringe, crazy sidebar drives me nuts.
Yeah. This bill has tons of Democrat support as well, and like you said, Cornel West said if it wasn't for the anarchists, they would have been smashed.
Thank you all for tuning in. This is Awareness is Music. Be sure to check them out. I highly recommend Indians in the Family by Don Peterson. Send me a message for suggestions or comments at time@dirtylaboratory.com. Please rate the show, share the show in this dismal age of algorithms, and see y'all next time.